The golden rows of corn stretched as far as the eye could see, tall stalks swaying gently in the late summer breeze, their husks rattling faintly as though whispering secrets to the earth that had nurtured them. It had taken months of hard labor, sweat rolling down my back under the relentless sun, late nights repairing irrigation lines, early mornings spreading fertilizer, and countless hours of vigilance to bring the harvest to this point, the perfect balance of ripeness where the kernels glistened like tiny nuggets of gold, promising not only food and income, but also the satisfaction of a farmer's proud reward. Yet standing at the edge of my property, leaning against the wooden fence that divided my land from the rest of the neighborhood, I couldn't help but notice the cold, calculating glare from across the street where Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, paced back and forth like a restless hawk surveying prey. She had never liked my presence in the neighborhood, had always called my farm an eyesore, dismissing the crop as unnecessary and against community standards, even though my land had been here for generations long before her cookie-cutter subdivision sprouted up. Yet she thrived on confrontation, her manicured nails tapping on a clipboard as if ready to write citations the way others write shopping lists, and she had escalated her complaints recently, first about the sound of my tractors, then the dust, then the smell of manure, none of which violated any law or ordinance, but each served her endless hunger for control. I had shrugged it off at first, knowing folks like her lived off imagined power, yet I could feel her hatred festering like a storm cloud, and one night, as I sat on my porch sipping black coffee under a blanket of stars, I noticed the faint flicker of movement by the edge of the fields, a figure darting quickly along the property line with something clutched in hand, and though the shadows concealed her fully, the air carried a chemical sharpness that burned my nostrils and churned my gut, the acrid stench of gasoline wafting on the breeze. But before I could even leap from the porch, the first orange tongue of flame licked upward, devouring a dry stalk. Then another, until an inferno roared to life with frightening speed, illuminating the night in a hellish glow, and my heart pounded with both fury and dread as I realized the madwoman had set my harvest ablaze. I bolted for the barn, grabbing hoses, buckets, anything that could fight the spreading flames, but fire has no master once it awakens, and it surged through the field like a living beast, popping husks with explosive cracks, sending waves of shimmering heat that forced me to shield my eyes, my skin burning from the sheer proximity. Yet amid the chaos, I could see her silhouette frozen across the street, the same Karen who had always prattled about property values and neighborhood standards, now standing transfixed by the monster. She had unleashed, her face pale in the glow, as if only then realizing that fire respects no fences, that sparks were leaping onto nearby yards, threatening the pristine vinyl siding of her own house and the delicate mulch beds she had so obsessively curated. And as sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every heartbeat, I could almost taste her panic carried in the night air because she knew what I knew, that she had gone too far. That this wasn't just another petty HOA squabble, but an act of arson that could spiral into catastrophe, and when the fire truck screeched to a halt at the curb, firefighters leaping out with hoses that thundered with pressurized water, one of them immediately pointed toward Karen's yard. Shouting orders as embers rained down dangerously close to her porch, she stumbled forward babbling excuses no one asked for, waving her hands as though she could push the flames back herself, her arrogance stripped bare, and in that instant, even through the smoke and chaos, I felt a strange calm wash over me, because the very woman who had tormented me relentlessly, who had dismissed my livelihood as worthless and disposable, was about to answer for her crime, not in some boardroom HOA meeting, but here in front of the men and women who put their lives on the line to contain her folly, and though my harvest was being consumed before my eyes, I knew the night's true story had only just begun. The scene quickly shifted from the chaos of flames to the chaos of human accountability, because while the firefighters fanned out with professional precision, unrolling heavy hoses, shouting coordinates to each other, dousing not just my fields, but the edge of the road, the neighbors' lawns, and even Karen's wooden fence that was beginning to smolder, the neighbors themselves spilled out of their houses, drawn by the noise and the eerie glow, their bathrobes flapping in the wind, their faces. Illuminated in horror and disbelief, they pointed, whispered, and some outright shouted accusations, as more than one person had caught sight of Karen creeping around before the blaze had erupted. And I stood there breathing heavily, smoke clawing in my lungs, my clothes singed with ash, watching the woman who had spent months trying to destroy me now, trying desperately to wriggle out of the noose she had tied around her own neck, because she paced back and forth, tears of hysteria streaking her. Mascara, her voice shrill as she screamed to anyone who would listen that she had seen suspicious figures near the farm, that she had just happened to be outside checking her mailbox, that she had nothing to do with it, but her words only made her look more guilty, the lies tumbling out too quickly, too rehearsed, as if she had thought through excuses long before she ever lit the match. Meanwhile, the fire chief, a broad-shouldered man with soot across his face, eyed her coldly while issuing calm orders to his crew, clearly piecing together the story that was being whispered by half the neighborhood. And I noticed with grim satisfaction that the deputy sheriff had arrived as well, his patrol car's lights cutting through the night like accusatory fingers. And the moment he stepped out, Karen lunged toward him, clinging to his uniform sleeve as though he were her savior, babbling about how dangerous it was for me to keep a farm in a residential community, about how I was reckless and someone had to do something, practically confessing without realizing it. Because her desperation betrayed her better than any witness could, I leaned against my fence post, my chest heaving with exhaustion and rage, trying to swallow the grief of watching acres of hard work turn to blackened husks. But I found myself holding onto a bitter sense of justice, because this wasn't just the loss of crops, it was the unveiling of a tyrant who had hidden behind bylaws and newsletters and now stood exposed under flashing red and blue lights. The sheriff pulled her aside, notebook in hand, his brow furrowed as he scribbled down details, while firefighters continued to battle the blaze that hissed and spit as water slammed against it, and the neighbors circled closer, some openly confronting her with cries of, "We saw you out there," and "You've gone too far this time, Karen." Their voices cutting through the night like knives, leaving her cornered not only by authority, but by the very community she once lorded over. And I thought of all the times she had humiliated others at HOA meetings, levying ridiculous fines for garden gnomes, holiday lights, or a slightly faded mailbox, the smug tilt of her chin as she declared herself the protector of property values, and now here she was, her empire of control crumbling around her as reality burned brighter than her lies. Still, part of me ached deeply, because this land was my life, these fields had been tended by my father and grandfather, and now charred stalks collapsed in rows like soldiers felled in battle, the smell of scorched corn so pungent it clung to my throat. But even through that grief, I knew this night would not end with me as the victim. It would end with her as the criminal, because arson is no petty HOA fine. It's a felony that can destroy entire neighborhoods. And the fire chief made that crystal clear as he barked at her, that homes could have been lost, lives endangered, all because of her selfish vendetta. She tried to stammer back about weeds and aesthetic harmony, but the words sounded absurd against the roar of hoses and the crackle of dying flames, and I could see the deputies exchanging looks, already weighing the charges, already piecing together a case, while I crossed my arms, silently daring her to spin another tale, because the truth was too obvious now. The fire had started at the property line where she had been seen, it had spread inward toward my harvest, and if not for the quick arrival of the fire department, half the subdivision might have been ash by dawn. Neighbors who once nodded politely at her during HOA gatherings now glared openly, some even filming with their phones, their cameras catching her unraveling in real time. And though she tried to slap at them, screeching about privacy violations, she only looked more deranged, her carefully curated image of control and superiority dissolving into a frantic caricature of guilt. Finally, the sheriff raised his hand, silencing the chaos, and announced that she would need to come down to the station for questioning, a statement that sent a ripple of gasps through the crowd, and she wailed in protest, clawing at her pearls as though the necklace could keep her tethered to her throne. But the deputies guided her firmly toward the cruiser, her protests echoing into the night, while I remained by the ruins of my field, my fists clenched at my sides, not out of helplessness, but out of resolve, because if Karen thought this war was going to end in intimidation, she was about to learn that farmers fight with patience, endurance, and truth, and this battle had just swung entirely out of her control. The night after the fire felt endless, the smoke still lingering in the air like a bitter reminder of everything I had lost, the ground still warm beneath my boots as I walked through the wreckage, crunching over blackened stalks that had once promised a season of prosperity, and though the firefighters had managed to contain the blaze before it reached the houses, my harvest months of backbreaking work lay in ruin, an ocean of ash stretching as far as I could see. Yet, even as grief gnawed at me, anger burned hotter, because Karen's smug face haunted my thoughts. The way she had pleaded with the sheriff, twisting her guilt into feigned victimhood, only to be led away in the back of a squad car while neighbors whispered in shock. And as I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee clutched in my hands, staring out at the devastation, I realized this was no longer a private feud between me and her. This was a turning point for the entire neighborhood, because the same people who had once tolerated her tyranny now had witnessed the lengths she would go, and I could already sense the shift in their loyalty. Her reign of petty fines and constant harassment was collapsing under the weight of her own cruelty. By morning, the sheriff's office had called, asking me to come down to give a full statement, and I drove into town with the heavy scent of smoke still clinging to my clothes, determined to lay out every detail I had seen, every complaint she had filed, every threat she had made about my farm being a blight on her perfect HOA kingdom, and the deputy who took my statement nodded gravely, assuring me that what she had done qualified as felony arson, that the district attorney would take it seriously given the danger to homes and families, and that neighbors' eyewitness accounts only strengthened the case. Leaving the station, I felt a grim satisfaction, not because justice was instant, but because it was finally set in motion, a seed planted that would grow stronger with time, and sure enough, as the days unfolded, I watched the neighborhood buzz with rumors, each retelling of the fire less forgiving to Karen, each neighbor's account more damning, until her name was spat like a curse in the very community she had once ruled. HOA board members tried to distance themselves from her, claiming they had no part in her actions, but I saw the fear in their eyes too, because her downfall dragged the entire HOA's credibility into question, and for once the power dynamic shifted, neighbors began knocking on my door, some offering apologies for not standing up to her sooner, others bringing pies or casseroles as though comfort food could soothe acres of lost corn. And while part of me appreciated the gestures, another part of me simmered with quiet determination, because I didn't just want pity, I wanted accountability, and I wanted to make sure no one like her could ever rise to power here again. Meanwhile, Karen had been released on bail, and though she avoided me directly, I heard she had been spotted skulking around town, her once perfectly styled hair now frayed, her voice hushed when she dared to speak, because people no longer looked at her with admiration or fear. They looked at her like a criminal hiding in plain sight, and every time she passed a neighbor, whispers followed her, parents pulling their kids away, friends crossing the street to avoid eye contact. I knew she must have been seething, humiliated by the very social circle she had spent years manipulating, and I imagined her sitting alone in her meticulously decorated home, watching her reputation unravel faster than her lies. But despite her disgrace, I also knew she wasn't done lashing out, because people like Karen didn't know how to accept defeat. They only knew how to escalate, and sure enough, a week after the fire, I found a letter taped to my fence post, her handwriting unmistakable in its jagged fury, accusing me of framing her, warning me that I would regret dragging her name through the mud, as if her own actions hadn't already buried her deeper than any words I could speak. And though I laughed bitterly at the absurdity of it, I also felt a chill settle over me, because if she had been bold enough to torch my fields once, there was no telling what she might try next. But this time I wasn't alone, because the neighborhood had turned against her, and when I showed the letter to the sheriff, he assured me it would be added to the growing stack of evidence, promising that intimidation would not help her case, only worsen it, and for the first time in months, I felt like the community and the law were finally on my side. Still, when I walked the perimeter of my charred fields at night, flashlight in hand, shotgun slung across my shoulder, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Karen was watching, that somewhere in the shadows her eyes still burned with hatred, plotting another desperate move, and though I told myself justice was near, I knew the storm wasn't over yet. It was only gathering strength, waiting for the next strike. The morning of Karen's court hearing dawned with a strange quiet, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm but before the air has fully cleared. And as I stood on my porch sipping strong coffee, staring out at the blackened expanse of my ruined fields, I knew this day would be more than just legal proceedings. It would be the reckoning of years of torment, not only for me, but for every neighbor she had bullied under the banner of HOA authority. And when I drove into town, parking outside the courthouse, I noticed clusters of familiar faces gathered on the steps, neighbors who had once cowered under her threats now whispering to each other, waiting to see justice served. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and paper, the murmurs of spectators blending with the shuffle of deputies moving in and out. And when Karen finally entered, escorted by her lawyer, I almost didn't recognize her. Her sharp heels were gone, replaced with modest flats, her designer suit wrinkled, her hair hastily pinned back as though she no longer had the energy to maintain the image of perfection she had clung to for so long. But what struck me most was her face. Pale, gaunt, eyes darting nervously around the room, searching for allies and finding none, because every gaze that met hers was cold, every whisper sharpened with resentment, and even the HOA board members who had once parroted her authority now sat stiffly apart, unwilling to be seen as her supporters. The district attorney presented the evidence with methodical precision. Photographs of the scorched fields, testimonies from neighbors who saw her creeping along the property line, the firefighter's account of where the blaze began, even the letter she had left taped to my fence, and each piece tightened the noose, painting a picture of deliberate malice that no excuse could unravel. Yet still her lawyer tried, spinning tales of mistaken identity, of misunderstandings, claiming she had been framed by resentful neighbors who didn't appreciate her commitment to community standards, but the words rang hollow, drowned out by the weight of truth, and when it was my turn to testify, I stood before the judge and jury, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest, recounting the night I saw her figure with that unmistakable kin in hand, the smell of gasoline in the air, the flames devouring my livelihood, and I let the silence that followed my words linger, heavy and undeniable, before stepping down. Karen shifted in her seat, wringing her hands, her once arrogant posture now crumbling, and when the judge finally spoke, declaring that the evidence was overwhelming and that the charges would move forward to trial, I saw her lips tremble as though the reality of her situation had finally struck like a hammer, because this wasn't just about petty fines or neighborhood disputes. This was a felony that could strip her of freedom, finances, and the fragile mask of superiority she had worn for years. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, cameras flashing as neighbors spoke openly about her reign of harassment, and I watched from the steps as Karen, shielded by her lawyer, tried to shove past the crowd, her head ducked low, but microphones still caught her voice cracking as she insisted she was misunderstood, her desperation more pitiful than persuasive. And in that moment, I felt the weight of vindication, not triumphant gloating, but the quiet relief of knowing her power was finally broken. Over the weeks that followed, her home sat in silence, the once pristine lawn unkempt, mail piling up, the HOA collapsing into disarray. Without her iron grip, and slowly, life in the neighborhood began to heal. Families decorated their houses without fear of fines, children played freely in yards once deemed too noisy, and though my fields remained blackened scars on the land, I knew the soil would recover just as we all would. Because resilience is born from fire as much as destruction, and when months later, Karen was finally sentenced guilty of arson and reckless endangerment, ordered to pay restitution and serve years behind bars. I drove past the courthouse once more, the autumn wind crisp against my face, and thought of how justice sometimes moves slowly, but when it arrives, it burns brighter than any blaze she could have started, and I whispered a silent promise to my land, to my family's legacy, that no one, not even an HOA tyrant like Karen, would ever steal our roots again. Because though she had torched my harvest, she had unknowingly planted something far stronger in its place: unity, resilience, and the end of her reign of fear.